Mother Bear donated blood to save dying human baby. What happened next left everyone speechless. The forest held its breath that morning, as if the ancient trees knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. Lily Morgan pressed her infant daughter closer to her chest, feeling the irregular rhythm of Haley's heartbeat through the thin blanket. The baby's skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality over the past 3 weeks, and no doctor in the county could explain why. They had run every test, consulted specialists from the city, and still her daughter was fading like morning mist under an unforgiving sun. The weight of helplessness had driven Lily to this moment, standing at the edge of the old growth forest that locals whispered about in hushed tones. She had heard the stories since childhood, tales her grandmother told about the woods that could heal what medicine couldn't touch. Most people laughed at such stories now, called them superstition, but when you're watching your child slip away breath by breath, you'll believe in anything that offers even a whisper of hope. The morning air carried a strange warmth despite the early hour, and as Lily stepped between the first massive trunks, she felt as though she was crossing into another world entirely. The sounds of the highway behind her faded until all she could hear was the soft rustle of leaves overhead and her own careful footsteps on the moss-covered ground. Haley stirred weakly in her arms, letting out a small whimper that tore at Lily's heart. The doctors had given them maybe another week, 2 at most, before her body would simply stop fighting whatever invisible enemy was consuming her from within. But Lily couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept it, which is why she found herself walking deeper into these woods that her rational mind told her held no answers. Yet something else, something deeper than logic, pulled her forward. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral of green and gold where sunlight filtered through in thin, dancing beams. She had been walking for nearly an hour when she reached the clearing. It appeared suddenly, as if the forest had parted just for her, revealing a circular space where wildflowers grew in impossible colors, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with an energy she couldn't name. Lily's legs trembled from exhaustion and emotion as she sank to her knees in the soft grass, cradling Haley against her chest. The baby's breathing had become so shallow it was barely perceptible, and her tiny fingers, once so eager to grasp at everything, lay limp against the blanket. Tears streamed down Lily's face as she looked up at the canopy above, not knowing what she was asking for or who she was asking it from. She just knew she needed something, anything, to save her child. The words that came from her lips weren't planned or rehearsed. They were raw, desperate, the kind of prayer that comes from a place beyond language. She spoke to the trees, to the earth beneath her, to whatever force had created this place of impossible beauty, begging for mercy, for time, for a miracle she knew she had no right to expect. That's when she heard it, a sound that made every muscle in her body tense with primal fear, the crack of a branch, too heavy to be caused by wind, too deliberate to be random. Lily's eyes darted around the clearing's edge, and there, emerging from the shadows between 2 ancient oaks, was the largest bear she had ever imagined could exist. The creature moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive, its dark fur catching the filtered sunlight in a way that made it appear almost ethereal. Every instinct screamed at Lily to run, to protect her baby, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, not just by fear, but by something else, something in the bear's eyes that held her in place. They weren't the eyes of a wild animal, or at least not only that. There was an intelligence there, a depth of understanding that made no sense. The bear continued its approach, slow and measured, until it stood just feet away from where Lily knelt. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously as Mother and Bear regarded each other. Lily could see the bear's own cubs now, two small forms hovering at the edge of the clearing, watching their mother with the same intensity that Lily watched her. The massive creature lowered its head, sniffing at the bundle in Lily's arms, and for one terrifying moment, Lily thought this was how it would end, torn apart by nature's indifference to human suffering. But the bear did something that defied every law of nature Lily thought she knew. It made a sound, low and rumbling, almost like a purr, and gently, impossibly gently, nudged Haley's blanket with its enormous snout. The baby, who hadn't responded to anything in hours, suddenly gasped, a real, deep breath that filled her tiny lungs. The bear stepped back, and as it did, Lily noticed something she hadn't seen before. There was a wound on the bear's foreleg, not fresh but not fully healed either, seeping a substance that caught the light in a way that blood never could. The bear extended its injured leg toward them, and drops of that strange luminescent fluid fell onto the grass near Haley. Without understanding why, driven by an instinct she couldn't name, Lily reached out with trembling fingers and touched the substance. It was warm, almost alive, pulsing with an energy that made her skin tingle. The bear watched as Lily, moving as if in a dream, brought her fingers to Haley's lips. The moment the substance touched the baby's mouth, color began to return to her cheeks. Her breathing deepened, became regular, strong. The bear made that rumbling sound again, then turned and walked back toward its cubs. Before disappearing into the forest, it looked back once, and in that look, Lily saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It wasn't just intelligence, it was recognition, as if the bear knew exactly what it had done and why. Lily sat in that clearing for another hour, holding Haley as the baby's condition continued to improve with each passing minute. The terrible gray pallor was gone, replaced by the healthy pink of a normal infant. Her eyes, when they finally opened, were bright and clear, focusing on her mother's face with an alertness that had been absent for weeks. Lily wept then, great heaving sobs of relief and confusion and gratitude all mixed together. She didn't understand what had happened, couldn't explain it even to herself, but she knew with absolute certainty that her daughter had been saved. The forest around them seemed to pulse with life, every leaf and branch and blade of grass participating in some ancient celebration she could feel but not comprehend. When she finally stood to leave, Lily noticed that the spot where the bear's fluid had fallen had sprouted tiny flowers, delicate white blooms that hadn't been there before, their petals seeming to glow with an inner light. The walk back through the forest felt different. The trees, that had seemed mysterious and perhaps threatening on her journey in now, felt protective, almost welcoming. Haley cooed and gurgled in her arms, sounds Lily hadn't heard in so long she'd forgotten how musical they could be. Every few steps, Lily would stop and check, certain that this improvement was temporary, that any moment her daughter would relapse. But Haley remained vibrant, alive in a way that seemed almost more than normal, as if she'd been given not just life, but something extra, something more. The forest gradually gave way to the familiar sights of civilization, the parking area where Lily had left her car appearing like a doorway between worlds. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, looking back at the forest, then at Haley secured in her car seat, trying to bridge the gap between what she knew had happened and what she could possibly tell anyone. The drive home was surreal. The normal world of traffic lights and stop signs, of other drivers going about their ordinary days, felt impossibly distant from what she'd just experienced. Lily knew she should take Haley straight to the hospital, have her examined, make sure this miraculous recovery was real and lasting. But she also knew that no medical test would explain what had happened in that clearing. How could she tell doctors that a wild bear had somehow healed her dying child? They would think she was delusional, perhaps even dangerous. They might take Haley away from her. So instead, she drove home, to the small house she'd been certain she would return to alone, or with a child who had only days left. The familiar rooms felt foreign now, as if she was seeing them through different eyes. Everything was the same, yet everything had changed. That night, Lily didn't sleep. She sat by Haley's crib, watching her daughter breathe, easily, normally, miraculously. She thought about the bear, about its eyes, about the deliberate nature of its actions. It hadn't been random or accidental. The bear had chosen to help them, had given something of itself to save a human child. The wound on its leg, Lily realized, might not have been a wound at all, or at least not in the traditional sense. Perhaps it was something else, some natural process she didn't understand, couldn't understand with her limited human perspective. She thought about the stories her grandmother had told, stories she'd dismissed as folklore and fantasy. But what if they weren't stories at all? What if they were memories, passed down through generations, of a time when humans and nature communicated in ways that modern life had made us forget? As dawn broke through her window, Lily made a decision. She wouldn't tell anyone the full truth of what had happened, not yet, maybe not ever. She would take Haley to the doctor, let them marvel at her recovery, accept their theories about spontaneous remission or misdiagnosis. But she would know the truth, carry it with her like a secret treasure. And someday, when Haley was old enough to understand, she would tell her daughter about the morning when the boundaries between human and nature, between possible and impossible, had dissolved in a forest clearing. She would tell her about the mother bear who had recognized another mother's desperation and had responded with an act of incomprehensible generosity. Looking at Haley's peaceful face, Lily whispered a promise to return to the forest. Not to ask for anything more, but to say thank you in whatever way the forest would understand. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Lily had barely finished feeding Haley when someone knocked at her door. She opened it to find a man in his 30s, dressed in practical outdoor clothing, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a backpack that had seen better days. He introduced himself as Ethan Marshall, a biologist conducting research in the old-growth forest. His expression was curious but kind as he explained that he'd found some unusual tracks and disturbances in a clearing, along with something else, something that had led him to her door. From his backpack, he pulled out a small container, and inside was a sample of the same luminescent substance that had saved Haley. Lily's heart raced as she tried to keep her expression neutral, but Ethan's next words made her blood run cold. He had cameras, he said, motion-activated cameras set up throughout the forest for his research. They had captured something extraordinary, something that defied scientific explanation, and the GPS coordinates from his equipment had tracked movement from that clearing to this neighborhood. Lily invited him in, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. If he had footage, if there was proof of what had happened, what would that mean? For her, for Haley, for the bear, and for the forest itself. Ethan sat at her kitchen table, pulling out a tablet from his backpack. His hand shook slightly as he operated it, and Lily could see that whatever he'd discovered had shaken his scientific worldview. The footage was grainy, partially obscured by leaves and morning mist, but it was clear enough. There was Lily, entering the clearing with Haley. There was her collapse to her knees, her desperate prayer to the universe. And there, emerging from the forest like something from a dream, was the bear. Ethan paused the video, looking up at Lily with eyes full of questions. But before he could speak, Haley began to cry from her nursery, a healthy, strong cry that just days ago Lily had thought she might never hear again. As Lily returned with Haley in her arms, she found Ethan staring at the paused image on his screen, his expression one of profound contemplation. He looked up at the healthy baby, then back at the screen, which showed the same child clearly ill and fragile. The transformation was undeniable, even through the poor quality of the footage. But what struck Ethan most, what he pointed out to Lily with a trembling finger, was something she hadn't noticed in the moment. In the video, as the bear approached them, other animals had emerged at the clearing's edge. Deer, rabbits, even birds, all watching with what could only be described as intentional interest. It wasn't random wildlife behavior, it was coordinated, purposeful, as if the entire forest had participated in what happened. Ethan's scientific training warred with what his eyes were showing him. He had spent years studying animal behavior, ecosystem interactions, biological processes. Nothing in his education or experience could explain what he was seeing. The substance he'd collected, he told Lily, had properties unlike anything in the scientific literature. Under microscopic examination, it seemed to be alive, but not in any way that fit the definition of life as science understood it. It responded to stimuli, seemed to have a form of consciousness, or at least reactivity that suggested intelligence. When he'd tested it with various compounds, it had reorganized itself at a molecular level, adapting, learning, evolving in real time. It was, he said quietly, as if he'd discovered a completely new form of life, or perhaps something that transcended the boundary between living and non-living matter. The weight of this discovery sat heavy between them. Lily could see the conflict in Ethan's eyes, the struggle between his duty to science and something else, something more human. If he published his findings, if he revealed what he'd discovered, the forest would be overrun. Scientists, government agencies, pharmaceutical companies, they would all descend upon that peaceful place. The bears, the mysterious substance, everything would be captured, studied, dissected in the name of progress. The very thing that had saved Haley would be destroyed in the attempt to understand it. Ethan knew this. Lily could see he knew it, and the knowledge was tearing him apart. He had dedicated his life to the pursuit of scientific truth, but what good was truth if it led to destruction? Lily made a decision then, one that surprised even her. She told Ethan everything, every detail of what had happened in the clearing. She spoke about the bear's eyes, the intelligence she'd seen there, the deliberate nature of its actions. She described the way the forest had felt, alive and aware in a way that went beyond the sum of its parts. She told him about her grandmother's stories, the old beliefs that the forest was not just a collection of trees and animals but a single, conscious entity that occasionally, rarely, chose to interact with humans who came with pure need and honest hearts. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from skepticism to wonder to something approaching understanding. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at Haley, who had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, peaceful and healthy and alive. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told Lily about his own experiences in the forest, things he'd never reported, never even written in his personal journals. Times when he'd felt watched, not by animals but by the forest itself. Moments when his equipment had failed in ways that made no sense, only to start working again once he'd moved to a different area, as if certain places were off limits. He talked about patterns in animal behavior that suggested communication across species, coordination that ecology couldn't explain. He had thought he was imagining things, letting the isolation and beauty of the forest play tricks on his rational mind. But now, seeing what had happened with Lily and Haley, he wondered if he'd been witnessing something that science simply wasn't equipped to understand yet. The question remained, though, of what to do with this knowledge. Ethan had the footage, the samples, enough evidence to revolutionize biology, maybe even our understanding of life itself. But he also had a choice, perhaps the most important choice of his scientific career. As he looked at Haley, sleeping peacefully after her miraculous recovery, the decision became clear. Some things, he said slowly, were more important than scientific advancement. Some mysteries needed to be protected, not solved. He would delete the footage, destroy the samples, alter his research notes. The forest's secret would remain secret. But he had one condition. He wanted to understand more, not as a scientist looking to publish and claim credit, but as a human being trying to comprehend something greater than himself. He wanted Lily to take him back to the clearing, to see if the forest would reveal more of its mysteries to someone who came not to take, but to learn. Lily agreed, though she warned him that the forest might not respond the same way twice. What had happened with Haley was, she believed, a singular event, a moment when desperate need had aligned with the forest's incomprehensible will. But Ethan was willing to try, to approach the forest with humility rather than the arrogance of scientific conquest. They made plans to return together in a few days, once Lily was certain Haley's recovery was stable. As Ethan prepared to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at them with an expression of profound gratitude. He thanked Lily, not just for trusting him with the truth, but for reminding him why he'd become a scientist in the first place. It wasn't for fame or publications or grants. It was for moments like this, when the universe revealed itself to be far more mysterious and wonderful than humans could imagine. Over the next few days, Lily watched Haley carefully for any signs of relapse, but the baby continued to thrive. More than thrive, actually. She seemed to be developing faster than normal, her eyes tracking movement with unusual focus, her hands grasping with surprising strength. The pediatrician, when Lily finally took her in for a checkup, was astounded. Not only was there no trace of whatever illness had been killing her, but all her developmental markers were advanced. The doctor had no explanation, could only shake his head in wonder and talk about spontaneous remission, about the mysteries of the human body. Lily nodded and smiled and said nothing about bears or forests or substances that glowed with their own light. That knowledge was not for the sterile world of hospitals and medical journals. It belonged to something older, deeper, more connected to the earth than modern medicine could ever be. When the day came to return to the forest, Lily felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She arranged for a neighbor to watch Haley, not wanting to bring the baby back so soon, not knowing how the forest might react to their return. Ethan met her at the forest's edge, and she could see he'd been thinking deeply about everything that had happened. He had brought minimal equipment, just a notebook and pencil, no cameras or sampling tools. He understood, without being told, that this visit was about observation and respect, not documentation and analysis. As they walked the familiar path to the clearing, Lily noticed things she'd missed in her desperation during the first visit. Symbols carved into tree bark that looked ancient, older than any human settlement in the area. Arrangements of stones that seemed deliberate, purposeful, like markers or messages in a language she couldn't read. The clearing, when they reached it, was different. The flowers that had sprouted where the bear's substance had fallen had spread, creating a carpet of those strange, glowing white blooms. The air itself felt charged, alive with possibility. Ethan stood at the edge, his eyes wide with wonder, taking in every detail. He pointed out things Lily hadn't noticed, the way certain trees seemed to lean toward the clearing's center, how the undergrowth formed patterns that looked almost like circuitry when viewed from the right angle. He spoke softly about theories he'd been developing, ideas that bordered on philosophy as much as science. What if consciousness wasn't limited to individual organisms? What if forests, especially old-growth forests like this one, developed a form of collective awareness over centuries? Not supernatural, but natural in a way humanity hadn't yet learned to recognize or measure. They stayed in the clearing for hours, not speaking much, just observing. No bears appeared, no dramatic events occurred, but there was something, a presence that both of them could feel. It was like being in a vast library where all the books were written in a language you couldn't read, but somehow understood on a level deeper than words. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, Ethan pulled out his notebook and showed Lily sketches he'd made. Not scientific diagrams, but artistic interpretations of what he'd seen and felt. The drawings were beautiful, capturing something essential about the forest that photographs never could. He talked about changing his research focus, about studying the forest not to exploit its secrets but to understand how humans could better coexist with such places, how we could remember the connections we'd lost. As they prepared to leave, something extraordinary happened. The flowers in the clearing began to glow more brightly as darkness fell, and in that light patterns emerged. The blossoms formed spirals and circles, geometric shapes that seemed impossibly precise for random plant growth. Ethan gasped, recognizing mathematical sequences in the arrangements, Fibonacci spirals, golden ratios, patterns that appeared throughout nature but never so deliberately displayed. It was as if the forest was showing them something, teaching them in a language that transcended words. They stood transfixed, watching as the patterns shifted and evolved, telling a story neither of them could fully understand, but both felt in their bones. It was a story about connection, about the web of life that linked all things, about the intelligence that emerged from complexity and time and patient growth. When the light finally faded and the patterns dissolved back into random-seeming scatter of flowers, Lily and Ethan left the clearing in thoughtful silence. The walk back was meditative, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd witnessed. At the forest's edge, they paused, looking back at the darkness between the trees. Ethan spoke first, his voice filled with quiet determination. He would protect this place, he promised, would find ways to ensure it remained undisturbed. Not by hiding it or building fences, but by teaching people to see forests differently, to understand them as more than resources to be harvested or wilderness to be conquered. He would use his scientific credentials not to expose the forest's secrets, but to advocate for its protection, to help others understand that some mysteries were meant to be preserved, not solved. Lily felt a deep relief at his words. She had been carrying the weight of this secret alone, and now she had an ally, someone who understood that what they'd discovered was both too important and too fragile to share with a world that wouldn't understand. They agreed to meet regularly, to return to the forest together, to learn what they could without taking anything away. It would be their secret project, a study in observation and respect rather than experimentation and exploitation. As they parted ways, Ethan heading to his research station and Lily to her car, both felt they had been initiated into something ancient and profound, something that would change how they saw the world forever. The drive home was peaceful, Lily's mind calm in a way it hadn't been since Haley first got sick. She thought about the patterns in the flowers, about the mathematical precision of their arrangement. It suggested an intelligence that was both alien and familiar, something that operated by rules humans could recognize but purposes we couldn't fathom. Perhaps that was the real gift the forest had given them. Not just Haley's healing, but this glimpse into a larger reality, a reminder that humanity's understanding of life and consciousness was still in its infancy. We had become so confident in our scientific knowledge, so certain we understood how the world worked, that we'd forgotten how much we didn't know, how much mystery remained. When she arrived home, Lily found Haley awake and alert in her neighbor's arms. The moment the baby saw her mother, she reached out with a smile that seemed to hold more awareness than a child her age should possess. The neighbor commented on how remarkably calm and observant Haley had been, how she seemed to study everything with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Lily thanked her neighbor and took Haley inside, holding her daughter close and whispering stories about the forest, about the bear, about the mysteries they were now part of. Haley listened, or seemed to, her eyes fixed on her mother's face with that unsettling focus. Lily wondered if the substance that had saved her had done more than just heal her body. Perhaps it had changed her in ways they wouldn't fully understand for years to come. That night, as Lily put Haley to bed, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In certain light, at certain angles, Haley's eyes seemed to reflect differently than they should, catching and holding light in a way that reminded Lily of the glowing flowers in the clearing. It was subtle, so subtle she might have imagined it, but she didn't think so. The forest had left its mark on both of them, a connection that went beyond the physical healing. They were part of something larger now, part of the secret network of consciousness that linked the old-growth forest to those it had chosen to trust. It was a responsibility as much as a gift, a promise to protect and preserve something that the modern world would destroy if given the chance. As the days turned into weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Lily returned to work, Haley continued to thrive, and to anyone looking from the outside, they were just another family who had weathered a medical crisis and come out the other side. But Lily knew better. She could feel the forest's presence sometimes, especially in quiet moments. It was like knowing someone was thinking about you, a warm awareness that she wasn't alone. Ethan visited regularly, always with new observations from his modified research, ways he was working to protect the forest without revealing its secrets. He had begun writing papers about forest consciousness from a theoretical perspective, carefully academic work that laid groundwork for protecting such places without ever mentioning what they both knew to be true. One evening, about a month after the healing, Ethan arrived at Lily's door with an expression of barely contained excitement. He had been reviewing old documents, historical records from the area, and had found references dating back centuries to the healing properties of the old-growth forest. Indigenous stories, settler accounts, even some early scientific expeditions had noted unusual phenomena. But what excited him most was a pattern he'd discovered: the healings, the miraculous recoveries. They happened in cycles, roughly every 20 to 30 years, and each time it involved a child. Always a child on the edge of death. And always there were reports of unusual animal behavior, particularly bears acting in ways that defied their nature. The forest, it seemed, had been doing this for far longer than they could have imagined. This revelation changed everything. It suggested that what happened to Haley wasn't random or unique, but part of some ancient pattern, some purpose that the forest had been fulfilling for generations. But why children? Why the specific timing, and why bears as the intermediary? Ethan had theories, ideas about genetic diversity, about the forest seeding human populations with something that would help preserve the connection between humanity and nature. But they were just theories, impossible to prove without the kind of investigation that would destroy the very thing they were trying to understand. They would have to be content with mystery, with knowing that they were part of something larger without fully understanding what that something was. The knowledge was both comforting and unsettling. Lily found herself looking at Haley differently, wondering what role her daughter would play in this ancient pattern. Would she grow up with abilities others didn't have? Would she be called back to the forest someday? Would she become a bridge between the human world and the older, deeper intelligence that lived in the wild places? There were no answers, only questions that multiplied with each passing day. But Lily found peace in the uncertainty. After all, she had learned that the world was far more magical than she'd ever imagined, that miracles weren't just stories from ancient times, but things that could happen on an ordinary morning to an ordinary mother who had the courage to believe in something beyond the rational. The autumn had painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson when Ethan made his most startling discovery. He had been spending more time in the woods, not just in the clearing but throughout the ancient growth, mapping patterns that only became visible when you stopped trying to see them directly. It was like those magic eye pictures where the image only emerged when you relaxed your focus, let your vision go soft around the edges. The forest, he was learning, communicated in similar ways, through subtle shifts in temperature, barely perceptible changes in air pressure, patterns in the way leaves fell or moss grew. He had started keeping a different kind of journal, one that recorded feelings and impressions rather than data and measurements. The scientific community would have laughed at him, but Ethan no longer cared about their approval. He was learning a different kind of science, one that acknowledged the limits of human understanding. It was during one of these meditation-like observation sessions that he noticed the trees were singing. Not literally, of course, but there was a vibration, a resonance that traveled through the root systems and created harmonics in the air above. He could feel it more than hear it, a deep thrumming that seemed to match the rhythm of his own heartbeat when he stood still enough, breathed slowly enough. The frequency was so low it was almost below human perception, but it was there, had always been there, waiting for someone to slow down enough to notice. When he mentioned this to Lily during one of their regular meetings, she smiled and told him that Haley had been humming the same low tone in her sleep, a sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest and filled the room with an inexplicable sense of peace. They decided to conduct an experiment, though experiment was perhaps too clinical a word for what they had in mind. They would bring Haley to the forest, not to the clearing, but to the edge, to see how she responded to being near the place that had saved her. Lily was nervous about this, protective of her daughter in ways that went beyond normal maternal instinct. But Haley was growing faster than expected, already pulling herself up to stand at just 8 months old, her eyes tracking movement with an intelligence that sometimes made strangers uncomfortable. She needed to understand her connection to the forest, and they needed to understand what the forest had done to her, or for her, or perhaps with her. The distinction between those prepositions seemed to matter less and less as time went on. The day they chose was unseasonably warm, the kind of autumn, day that felt like summer's last gift before winter arrived. Haley was alert and calm in her carrier against Lily's chest, her eyes wide and focused as they approached the tree line. The moment they stepped into the shadow of the first trees, something changed. Haley's breathing synchronized with that deep, almost inaudible rhythm Ethan had discovered. Her tiny hand reached out, fingers spread, as if trying to touch something invisible in the air, and then, in a moment that would be burned into both Lily and Ethan's memories forever, every bird in the forest went silent. Not the normal pause that might happen when predators were near, but a complete, purposeful cessation of sound that felt like the world holding its breath. In that silence, other things became audible. The whisper of sap moving through tree veins, the microscopic crackling of bark expanding in the warmth, the conversation of roots beneath their feet. Haley made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a word, but something that seemed to be a response to these subtle communications. And then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came alive again, but differently. The birds sang in harmonies they'd never used before, creating layers of sound that felt like language just beyond understanding. Squirrels moved in coordinated patterns through the branches, their movements deliberate and synchronized. Even the wind seemed to respond, creating spirals of falling leaves that danced in impossible formations before settling gently around them. Ethan was frantically taking notes, trying to capture what he was witnessing, but his hand kept stopping, the pencil hovering over paper, as he realized the futility of trying to describe something that existed outside the boundaries of human language. This wasn't just animal behavior or atmospheric phenomena. This was communication, pure and direct, between the forest and this child who carried something of its essence within her. Lily felt it too, the sense that Haley was both her daughter and something more, a bridge between worlds that humans had forgotten existed. It wasn't frightening exactly, but it was overwhelming, like suddenly discovering you'd been living in 2 dimensions when reality had 3. They stayed for only an hour, both sensing that too much exposure too soon might be dangerous, though dangerous wasn't quite the right word. Transformative, perhaps. Irreversible. As they walked back to the car, Haley fell into a deep sleep, her breathing still matching that forest rhythm. That night, she slept for 14 hours straight, and when she woke, there was something different about her eyes. They held knowledge, or perhaps recognition, as if she remembered something from before she was born. Lily found herself wondering if the substance from the bear had done more than heal her daughter's body. Perhaps it had awakened something that had always been there, dormant in human DNA, waiting for the right catalyst to activate it. Over the following weeks, Ethan dove deeper into his research, but now he was looking in different places. Not in scientific journals, but in anthropological texts, indigenous oral histories, myths, and legends from around the world. What he found astounded him. Stories of children blessed by nature, of forests that could grant gifts or curses, of bears as mediators between the human and natural worlds. These weren't isolated tales, but patterns that appeared across cultures that had never interacted. The details differed, but the core was always the same. Nature, particularly old forests, had consciousness and occasionally chose to intervene in human affairs through animal intermediaries. And always, there was mention of a substance, a gift from the forest that could heal or transform. He shared his findings with Lily on a cold November evening, spreading old books and photocopied pages across her kitchen table, while Haley played on the floor, stacking blocks in patterns that looked random until you stepped back and saw the mathematical precision of their arrangement. According to these stories, children like Haley were not just healed, but chosen. They became what one text called speakers for the silent, humans who could understand and translate the needs of the natural world. In the past, such children had become shamans, healers, leaders who guided their communities to live in harmony with their environment. But in the modern world, with its disconnection from nature, what role could such a child play? The question haunted them both. They could see Haley developing abilities that had no place in contemporary society. She could calm agitated animals with a look, could predict weather changes hours before they occurred, seemed to know when plants needed water, or when someone was ill before symptoms appeared. These were subtle things, easily dismissed or explained away. But Lily and Ethan knew better. They were watching something unprecedented, or rather, something that hadn't been seen for generations. A human child growing up with one foot in civilization and another in the wild consciousness of the forest. The responsibility of guiding her, protecting her, helping her understand her gifts without letting the world discover and exploit them, was overwhelming. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the forest in snow that muffled sound and transformed the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Ethan's visits became less frequent as travel grew difficult, but he and Lily stayed in constant contact, sharing observations about Haley's development and discussing how to handle what they both knew was coming. Haley would soon be walking, talking, interacting with others who wouldn't understand her differences. How could they protect her secret while allowing her to have a normal childhood? How could they teach her to use her gifts responsibly when they barely understood them themselves? These questions kept Lily awake at night, staring at the ceiling while listening to Haley's peaceful breathing, that same forest rhythm that never left her. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Lily heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold, then warm with recognition. Outside her window, barely visible in the moonlight reflected off snow, stood the bear. The same bear, she was certain, though how she knew this she couldn't say. It stood on its hind legs, massive and magnificent, looking directly at her window. Lily's first instinct was fear, but that quickly gave way to something else. Understanding. The bear hadn't come to threaten but to check, to see how the child it had saved was growing. Lily picked up Haley, who had awakened without crying, and brought her to the window. The moment Haley saw the bear, she laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the room with warmth. The bear dropped to all fours, nodded its massive head once, and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Lily found tracks in the snow, not just of the bear but of other animals too, deer, rabbits, even the delicate prints of birds, all converging on her house then spreading out again like rays from a sun. It was as if the forest had sent a delegation to check on Haley, to ensure she was safe and thriving. When she told Ethan about this, he wasn't surprised. His research had uncovered similar stories, what indigenous peoples called the watching, when the natural world monitored those it had touched to ensure they were fulfilling their purpose. But what was Haley's purpose? What did the forest expect from her? These questions became more urgent as Haley grew, and her abilities became harder to hide. The answer came in spring, in a way neither of them expected. A development company had purchased large tracts of land adjacent to the old-growth forest, planning to build a massive resort complex. The forest itself was protected, technically, but the development would destroy the buffer zones, the transitional spaces where the domestic and wild overlapped. It would bring noise, pollution, thousands of people to the very edge of something that required solitude and respect to survive. Lily felt sick when she heard the news, and Haley, now walking with steady determination despite being barely a year old, became agitated in a way Lily had never seen. She stood at the window facing the forest, her small hands pressed against the glass, making sounds that weren't quite words, but carried meaning nonetheless. Ethan arrived that evening with more bad news. The development company had hired their own scientists to survey the area, and they were spinning the narrative that the forest was just trees. Valuable for lumber maybe, but certainly not worth preserving at the cost of economic development. His careful academic papers about forest consciousness were being dismissed as fantasy, his reputation questioned. The company had resources, lawyers, public relations firms. How could they fight against that? How could they make people understand what would be lost if the forest was isolated, cut off from the larger ecosystem, turned into a small island of wilderness surrounded by human chaos? That night, something extraordinary happened. Haley, who had spoken only a few words despite her advanced development in other areas, walked to the door and said clearly, "Go forest now." Lily's heart raced. It was past midnight, cold despite the spring weather, and taking a toddler into the woods in darkness went against every maternal instinct. But there was something in Haley's voice, an authority that seemed to come from beyond her tiny frame. Lily bundled them both in warm clothes and called Ethan, who answered immediately as if he'd been waiting. He met them at the forest edge, and together they followed Haley, who walked with purpose despite the darkness, leading them not to the familiar clearing but deeper, to a part of the forest none of them had explored. What they found there changed everything. It was another clearing, larger than the first, and in its center grew a tree, unlike anything in any botanical textbook. It was ancient, impossibly ancient, its trunk so wide it would take a dozen people holding hands to encircle it. But more than its size, it was what the tree was doing that defied explanation. It glowed, not with reflected light but with its own luminescence, a soft, pulsing radiance that seemed to breathe with the same rhythm they'd all come to recognize. The tree's roots, visible above ground in massive, twisted formations, connected to every other tree they could see, creating a network that pulsed with that same light, fainter but unmistakable. This was the heart of the forest, the central node of its consciousness. Haley walked forward without hesitation, placing her tiny hand on the glowing bark. The moment she made contact, the entire forest responded. Every tree in sight brightened, the light traveling through the root networks like neurons firing in a vast brain. And then, in a moment that defied every law of nature they thought they knew, images appeared in the air around them. Not hallucinations, but something more like holograms, though that word felt inadequate. They saw the forest's history, centuries compressed into moments. They saw the first indigenous peoples who had known and protected this place. They saw the arrival of settlers, the near destruction of the forest, its slow recovery. They saw other children like Haley throughout history, each playing a crucial role in preserving the connection between human and natural worlds. But more than history, they saw the present danger with a clarity that was overwhelming. The development wasn't just a threat to the forest's peace, but to its very existence. The tree showed them how the forest's consciousness depended on a certain critical mass, a minimum territory needed to maintain the complex interactions that created awareness. The development would push it below that threshold, and the consciousness that had existed for millennia would simply cease, like a flame deprived of oxygen. All the accumulated wisdom, the deep intelligence that had saved Haley and countless others, would be lost forever. The images shifted, showing possible futures, and in the ones where the development proceeded, the light in the trees gradually dimmed until there was only darkness. Ethan was weeping openly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Lily held Haley, who seemed calm, as if this was exactly what she had expected to find. The images continued, now showing them something else, a way forward. The forest couldn't fight the development directly, but it could reveal itself. Not fully, but enough to change minds. It needed ambassadors, humans who could bridge the gap between the forest's alien intelligence and human understanding. It needed Haley, yes, but also them, Lily and Ethan, and others who could be awakened to the truth. The images showed gatherings in the clearing, people from all walks of life coming to experience what they had experienced. Not the full revelation, but enough to understand that this place was special, worth protecting. The challenge was how to do this without destroying the very thing they were trying to save. Too much attention would bring scientists who would want to study and dissect. Too little would mean the development would proceed unchecked. They needed to find a balance, to create a movement that was more spiritual than scientific, more experiential than analytical. The forest, through these images, was showing them how. Small groups, carefully chosen, brought to the forest not to take, but to receive. People who would leave changed, who would spread the word not through academic papers or news reports, but through personal transformation, through stories told quietly to those ready to listen. As the images faded and the tree's glow dimmed to a soft luminescence, Haley spoke again, more words than she'd ever said at once. Forest teaches, we learn, we teach, others learn, circle grows. Her voice carried that same authority, that sense of speaking for something far older and wiser than her physical form suggested. Lily understood then that her daughter wasn't just healed by the forest, but had become part of it, a living link between two forms of consciousness. It was a profound responsibility, but also a gift. Haley would never be alone, would always carry within her the wisdom and support of the forest itself. They left the heart of the forest as dawn was breaking, each carrying within them a sense of purpose they hadn't had before. Ethan immediately began reaching out to his network, not his scientific colleagues, but others he'd met who studied consciousness, meditation, indigenous wisdom. People who might be open to experiencing something beyond the rationale. Lily started a blog, carefully written, that told stories about the forest without revealing its location, building an audience of people who understood that some places were sacred, deserving of protection, not for what they could give us, but for what they were. And Haley, despite her young age, seemed to understand her role perfectly, displaying her gifts only when necessary, always in ways that seemed almost but not quite normal. The first group came to the forest on a full moon night in early summer. Just 5 people, each carefully chosen for their openness and discretion. Ethan and Lily led them to the original clearing, where the white flowers still grew in their impossible patterns. They didn't promise miracles, didn't even tell them what to expect. They simply asked them to sit, to breathe, to open themselves to whatever the forest wanted to share. What happened was different for each person, but all left changed. One, a journalist who had come skeptical, left with tears streaming down her face, unable to explain what she'd felt but knowing with absolute certainty that this place needed protection. Another, a wealthy businessman who'd made his fortune in real estate, experienced something that made him pledge significant funds to conservation efforts. Word spread slowly, carefully, just as the forest had shown them. Not a viral sensation, but a gradual awakening, person by person, story by story. The development company found their plans increasingly opposed, not by environmental extremists, but by ordinary people who couldn't quite explain why, but knew that this particular forest needed to remain untouched. Local politicians, initially supportive of the economic benefits, began to have second thoughts. Some had visited the forest themselves, had experienced something that changed their perspective. Others simply responded to the growing sentiment in their constituencies that some things were more valuable than money. Through it all, Haley grew, her development continuing to outpace normal children in subtle ways. She spoke in complete sentences by 18 months, but more remarkably, she seemed to understand languages she'd never been taught. Not fluently, but she could grasp the emotional content of any spoken language, could respond appropriately even when she shouldn't have understood the words. Ethan theorized that the forest's gift had enhanced her ability to perceive communication beyond the verbal, to understand the intent and feeling behind language rather than just the words themselves. It made her remarkably empathetic, able to comfort upset children or calm anxious adults with a touch or a look. The crisis came in late summer when the development company, frustrated by the unexpected resistance, decided to push forward aggressively. They brought in heavy equipment, planning to clear the buffer zones before any legal challenges could stop them. The morning the bulldozers arrived, something unprecedented happened. Every animal in the forest emerged from the tree line, not aggressively but simply standing there, watching. Bears, deer, foxes, rabbits, birds of every species, all perfectly still, all facing the machines. The operators, hardened construction workers who'd seen everything, stopped in their tracks. There was something deeply unsettling about those watching eyes. Something that spoke to a primal part of human consciousness that remembered when we were not separate from nature, but part of it. Haley was there that day, brought by Lily, who had somehow known this confrontation was coming. The toddler walked forward, past the line of animals toward the lead bulldozer. The operator, a man named Logan Carter, who would later say it was the most profound moment of his life, climbed down from his machine and knelt to meet her at eye level. Haley placed her small hand on his large, calloused one, and in that moment Logan saw what Lily and Ethan had seen in the heart of the forest. Not the full revelation, but enough. He saw the network of consciousness that connected every living thing, saw his own place in that web, saw what would be lost if they proceeded. When he stood, tears streaming down his weathered face, he walked back to his machine, started it up, and drove it away. The other operators, confused but responding to something in their foreman's expression, followed. The development company tried to bring in other crews, but word had spread through the construction community. That forest was different, protected by something that wasn't quite natural, wasn't quite supernatural, but was definitely real. No one wanted to be the one to destroy it. The company threatened lawsuits, offered bonuses, but nothing worked. Eventually, faced with mounting public pressure and the inexplicable reluctance of anyone to actually do the work, they abandoned the project. The land was eventually purchased by a conservation trust, funded by anonymous donors who had all, at various times, spent quiet hours in a certain clearing, experiencing something that couldn't be explained but couldn't be denied. As autumn returned, painting the forest once again in warm hues, Lily, Ethan, and Haley stood at the edge of the trees, looking out at the preserved buffer zones that would now remain wild. Haley, now walking and talking with the confidence of a much older child, looked up at her mother and Ethan with eyes that held depths neither of them fully understood. She spoke, her voice carrying that familiar authority that seemed to come from beyond her years. "The forest says thank you," she said simply. "But this is just the beginning." They knew she was right. The immediate threat had passed, but the larger challenge remained. How to help humanity remember its connection to the natural world. How to bridge the gap between human and forest consciousness. How to protect not just this one special place, but all the wild spaces that held wisdom we were only beginning to understand. The bear appeared one last time that winter, on Haley's second birthday. It stood at the forest edge as snow fell softly around it, watching as the little girl played in the yard. Haley saw it and waved, and the bear, in a gesture that should have been impossible for such a creature, seemed to wave back before disappearing into the trees. Lily and Ethan, watching from the window, understood that this was both an ending and a beginning. The acute phase of Haley's transformation was complete. She had been healed, changed, integrated into the forest's consciousness. Now came the longer, slower work of living with that gift, of finding ways to use it that honored both her human nature and her connection to something larger. Ethan published his book that spring, not a scientific treatise, but a philosophical exploration of consciousness in nature. He never mentioned the specific forest or Haley's story, but those who read carefully could sense the real experiences behind his theoretical discussions. The book found a small but passionate audience, people who had always felt that nature was more than resources and scenery, that there was an intelligence in wild places that deserved respect and protection. Some of these readers found their way to the forest, guided by intuition more than directions, and each left with their own story, their own piece of the larger truth that couldn't be fully expressed in words. Lily continued her work, both as a mother and as an informal guardian of the forest's secret. She organized the visits, screened the people who wanted to come, ensured that the forest's gift was shared with those who would honor it. She watched Haley grow, marveling at the child's ability to live in two worlds simultaneously, to be both a normal little girl who loved playground swings and picture books, and also something more, a bridge between realms of consciousness that most humans had forgotten existed. There were challenges, certainly. Times when Haley's abilities manifested in ways that were hard to explain, when other children or adults noticed something different about her. But they managed, with careful explanations and gentle redirections, to maintain the balance. The forest thrived, protected now not just by law, but by the growing network of people who had experienced its consciousness firsthand. Each person who spent time in the clearing came away with their own understanding, their own piece of the puzzle. Some saw it in scientific terms, as evidence of distributed consciousness in complex ecosystems. Others understood it spiritually, as proof of the sacred in nature. Still, others simply felt it emotionally, a deep connection that needed no explanation. All of them, regardless of how they interpreted the experience, became protectors, advocates for not just this forest but for wild places everywhere. Years passed, and Haley grew into her gifts with a grace that amazed everyone who knew her story. She could walk through the forest and understand its needs, knowing which trees were diseased, which areas needed protection, which animals were struggling. She became known in the community as someone who had a special way with nature, though only a few knew the full truth. She helped lost hikers find their way, not through tracking skills, but through an intuitive understanding of how the forest wanted them to move. She could predict storms days in advance, could sense when animals were about to give birth, could feel the health of the ecosystem like others felt their own heartbeat. The question of what Haley would do with her life as she grew older was one that occupied both Lily and Ethan. How could she have a normal career, a normal life, when she carried within her something so extraordinary? But Haley herself seemed unworried. She understood, with a wisdom beyond her years, that her path would reveal itself when the time was right. For now, she was content to be a child, to learn and grow, to deepen her connection with both the human and natural worlds. She went to school, made friends, did homework, all the normal things, but she also spent hours in the forest, learning from the trees and animals in ways that no human teacher could provide. The story spread, as stories do, changing with each telling. Some versions had the bear performing impossible feats, others focused on the mystical healing. Still others emphasized the environmental message. But at the core of every version was the same truth that Lily, Ethan, and Haley knew. The world was far more mysterious and interconnected than most people realized. Consciousness wasn't limited to human brains, but existed in networks and systems throughout nature. And sometimes, when the need was great and the hearts were open, the boundary between human and nature could dissolve, allowing for miracles that science couldn't explain but couldn't deny either. On quiet evenings, Lily would sit with Haley and tell her the story of her healing, of the bear, of the forest's gift. Haley would listen with that intense focus she'd had since infancy, occasionally adding details Lily didn't remember telling her, things she couldn't possibly know but somehow did. She would talk about the bear's thoughts, about what the forest felt, about the joy in the trees when they realized she would survive. These weren't fantasies or childhood imagination. They were memories, somehow preserved in whatever the forest had given her, accessible now that she was old enough to process them. The scientific community remained divided on Ethan's work. Some dismissed it as pseudoscience, others found it intriguing but unprovable. A few, those brave enough to visit the forest themselves, became quiet converts, pursuing research that pushed the boundaries of what biology and consciousness studies could encompass. Papers were published about mycelial networks and tree communication, about the possibility of emergent consciousness in complex ecosystems, about the ways indigenous knowledge had understood truths that Western science was only beginning to discover. None of these papers mentioned the specific forest or the miraculous healings, but those who knew the real story could see its influence everywhere. As Haley approached her 5th birthday, she began to display new abilities. She could influence plant growth, not dramatically but subtly, encouraging gardens to thrive, helping sick trees recover. She seemed to understand the languages of different animal species, not in words, but in intent and emotion. Most remarkably, she could sometimes share her perception with others, allowing them brief glimpses of the world as she saw it, interconnected and alive with consciousness. These moments were rare and precious, usually happening spontaneously when someone was particularly open or in great need. Each person who experienced this sharing was profoundly changed, unable to see nature as mere scenery ever again. The forest continued to evolve, too, or perhaps reveal more of itself. New clearings appeared, each with its own character and purpose. One became known as the Healing Grove, where people with illnesses that medicine couldn't cure would come to sit, not always finding physical healing, but always leaving with a peace that made their struggles bearable. Another clearing seemed designed for meditation and insight, where artists and thinkers would receive inspiration that transformed their work. The forest was teaching, sharing its wisdom in ways tailored to each visitor's needs and capacity to understand. There were challenges, of course. Word of the forest's special nature spread beyond the careful network they'd established. Curiosity seekers came, some with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to capture proof of the miraculous. But the forest had its own protections. Equipment would mysteriously fail, paths would seem to shift, and those who came with exploitative intentions would find themselves lost, walking in circles until they gave up and left. The forest, it seemed, chose who could find its secret places and who would wander its edges without ever reaching its heart. This self-protection allowed the secret to remain safe, even as more people became aware that something special existed in those woods. One summer evening, as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, Ethan made a discovery that changed their understanding of everything. He had been mapping the underground root networks, using new technology that could trace the connections without damaging them, when he realized the network extended far beyond the forest boundaries. The roots connected to trees in people's yards, in parks, along streets, creating a web that encompassed the entire region. The forest's consciousness wasn't confined to the protected area, but extended throughout the landscape, diminished but present wherever trees grew. This explained something they'd wondered about: how people who'd never visited the forest sometimes reported dreams or intuitions that seemed to come from outside themselves. This discovery led to a new phase of their work. Instead of just protecting the forest, they began to strengthen the entire network. They encouraged people to plant native trees, to create gardens that connected to the larger web, to see their yards not as separate properties but as part of a living system. Haley, young as she was, became central to this effort. She could sense where the network was weak, where new connections were needed, where human development had created gaps that could be bridged. Under her guidance, hidden by the appearance of normal community beautification projects, they began to rewire the landscape, strengthening the forest's extended consciousness. The transformation was subtle but profound. People throughout the region began reporting better sleep, clearer thinking, a sense of connection they couldn't quite explain. Gardens thrived, birds returned to areas they'd abandoned, and there was a gradual but noticeable increase in community cohesion. Neighbors who'd never spoken began sharing meals. Conflicts that had festered for years found peaceful resolution, and there was a growing sense that they were all part of something larger than themselves. Most people attributed these changes to normal social factors, but those who knew the truth understood that the forest's consciousness was gently influencing human behavior, encouraging the cooperation and connection that both species needed to thrive. As winter approached again, Lily reflected on how much had changed since that desperate morning when she'd carried her dying daughter into the forest. Haley was not just healthy but extraordinary, carrying within her a bridge between worlds. Ethan had transformed from a conventional scientist into something more like a modern shaman, interpreting the forest's wisdom for those ready to hear it. And she herself had become a guardian of one of the world's most profound secrets. A mother, not just to Haley but in some sense to the growing community of people touched by the forest's consciousness. The bear had not been seen for months, but Lily sometimes felt its presence, watching from deep in the woods, satisfied with how its gift had been received and honored. The story could have ended there, with the forest protected, Haley thriving, and the secret safe. But one night, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Haley woke her mother with words that chilled and thrilled in equal measure. "The forest says it's time," she said, her young voice carrying that ancient authority. "Time for the next child." Lily understood immediately. The cycle was continuing, another child somewhere was dying, and the forest was preparing to intervene again. But this time, they wouldn't be passive observers. This time, they would be part of the process, helping to guide and protect whoever was chosen next. Haley, despite her youth, would be a mentor, showing the new child how to live with the forest's gift. They found her 3 days later, a little girl named Savannah Reed, whose family had just moved to the area. She had a rare genetic condition that was shutting down her organs one by one, and her parents were desperate, having exhausted every medical option. It was Ethan who made the connection, recognizing the signs from his research into the historical patterns. He approached the family carefully, speaking of alternative treatments, of the healing power of nature, never mentioning bears or miraculous substances. The parents, with nothing left to lose, agreed to bring Savannah to the forest. They were skeptical, but willing to try anything that might help their daughter. The meeting was arranged for dawn, that liminal time when the boundary between night and day, sleeping and waking, possible and impossible, was thinnest. Lily and Haley met them at the forest edge, and even in the dim light they could see that Savannah was fading. She was conscious, but barely, her breathing shallow, her skin that familiar translucent quality that Lily remembered all too well. Haley walked over to the sick child, took her hand, and without words, began leading them into the forest. The parents started to protest, but something in Haley's manner, a confidence that no 5-year-old should possess, kept them silent. They followed, through paths that seemed to open just for them, deeper into the woods than any of them except Haley had ever been. They didn't go to the clearing where Lily had been saved, or to the heart of the forest with its glowing tree. Instead, Haley led them to a grove none of them had seen before, where the trees grew in a perfect circle, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with potential. In the center of the grove, waiting as if it had always been waiting, was not one bear, but 3. The same mother who had saved Haley, accompanied by her cubs, now grown but still clearly her offspring. The bears regarded the humans with that same impossible intelligence, and then the mother bear did something that made everyone gasp. She stood on her hind legs and extended her paw, not threateningly but in a gesture that was unmistakably an invitation. Savannah's mother, Jessica Brooks, driven by desperation and instinct, carried her daughter forward. The bear gently touched Savannah's forehead with its paw, and where it touched, that same luminescent substance appeared, Not blood, but something far more complex and alive. It spread across Savannah's skin like liquid light, sinking in, disappearing, leaving only a faint glow that gradually faded. The change was immediate. Savannah's breathing deepened, her eyes opened fully, and she looked around with wonder rather than the glazed expression of the dying. The bears made that low, rumbling sound, a harmony between the three of them, and then melted back into the forest, their part in the miracle complete. But this time, something additional happened. Haley stepped forward and placed her hands on Savannah's, and for a moment, both children glowed with that same forest light. It was a transfer of knowledge, Lily realized. Haley sharing what she'd learned about living with the forest's gift, passing on the wisdom that would help Savannah navigate her new reality. When the glow faded, both girls were smiling, and Savannah spoke her first strong words in weeks. "I understand," she said, looking at Haley with recognition that went beyond their brief acquaintance. They were sisters now, not by blood, but by something deeper, connected through the forest's consciousness in ways that would bind them for life. The integration of Savannah into their secret community was smoother than Haley's had been, partly because they now knew what to expect, partly because Savannah had Haley as a guide. The two girls became inseparable, spending hours in the forest together, learning from each other and from the trees. Savannah's abilities developed differently than Haley's. Where Haley could sense the forest's needs and communicate with animals, Savannah seemed to understand the healing properties of plants, knowing instinctively which combinations could help various ailments. Together, they were more powerful than either alone, their gifts complementing and amplifying each other. Jessica and her husband, Michael, became part of the inner circle of guardians, bringing their own skills and perspectives to the work of protecting and understanding the forest. Jessica was an artist, and her paintings of the forest, while never explicitly revealing its secrets, captured something of its essence that drew people to want to protect it. Michael was a lawyer, and he worked behind the scenes to strengthen the legal protections, to ensure that no future development could threaten what they now understood was not just a forest, but a living consciousness that had been growing and evolving for millennia. The community of protectors grew stronger, more diverse, better able to face whatever challenges might come. As the years passed, the pattern continued. Every generation, sometimes two, the forest would choose another child to save, to transform, to become part of its extended consciousness. Each child brought different gifts, different perspectives, different ways of bridging the human and natural worlds. They formed a network of their own, connected through the forest but living throughout the world, each working in their own way to protect and preserve the wild places that still held the old consciousness. Some became scientists, pushing the boundaries of what academia would accept about plant intelligence and ecosystem consciousness. Others became artists, teachers, healers, each using their gifts to help humanity remember its connection to the natural world. Haley grew into a remarkable young woman, her abilities refined and controlled, but no less miraculous. She could walk through any forest in the world and immediately understand its health, its needs, its potential. She became a consultant of sorts, though her clients never fully understood how she knew what she knew. She would arrive at threatened ecosystems and somehow find solutions that satisfied both human needs and natural preservation. Her methods were unconventional, often involving bringing key decision-makers to experience the forest's consciousness firsthand, but they worked. Lands that seemed destined for destruction were preserved, not through legal battles or protests, but through the transformation of hearts and minds. Savannah followed a different path, becoming a researcher in plant medicine, though her real work went far beyond what she published in journals. She developed treatments that seemed impossible, combinations of common plants that could address conditions Western medicine struggled with. She always credited indigenous knowledge and careful observation, never mentioning that the plants themselves had taught her their secrets. Her clinic became a place of last resort for those whom conventional medicine had failed, and while not everyone could be healed, everyone left with something, whether it was physical improvement, emotional peace, or spiritual awakening. The forest itself continued to evolve, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that it revealed more of its true nature over time. The network of consciousness that Ethan had discovered extended further than anyone had imagined, connecting to other old-growth forests around the world. These ancient groves, scattered across continents, formed nodes in a global consciousness that had been observing and occasionally influencing human development for millennia. The children saved by the forests were not random selections but careful choices, individuals whose genetics, circumstances, and potential aligned with the forest's incomprehensible purposes. They were antibodies in a sense, protecting the living earth from the damage that unconscious human activity might cause. This understanding brought both hope and responsibility. Hope that humanity and nature were not separate and antagonistic, but part of the same living system, capable of cooperation and mutual benefit. Responsibility because those who knew this truth had to protect it from those who would exploit it while finding ways to share it with those ready to understand. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and wisdom. The forest had given them gifts, but gifts came with obligations. They were stewards now, not just of a single forest, but of the connection between all life, the consciousness that emerged from complexity and interdependence. On a spring morning, 20 years after Haley's healing, Lily stood in the original clearing, now accompanied by a dozen children and young adults, all saved by various forests, all carrying within them that luminescent gift. They had gathered from around the world for what Haley called a convergence, a sharing of knowledge and experience that would help them face the challenges ahead. Climate change, habitat, destruction, the sixth extinction. These were not abstract concepts to them, but immediate threats to the consciousness they were part of. But they were not discouraged. They had seen miracles, had been miracles themselves. They knew that the earth had resources and resilience beyond human understanding. As they stood in a circle, hands joined, the forest around them began to glow with that familiar light. But this time, it spread beyond the clearing, beyond the forest, racing through root networks and fungal threads, through water and air, until observers around the world reported a strange luminescence in wild places, a brief but unmistakable sign that the earth itself was alive and aware. Most dismissed it as some unusual atmospheric phenomenon, but millions felt something shift, a subtle change in perception that made them look at nature differently. Seeds were planted that day, not physical seeds, but seeds of consciousness, of recognition, of remembering what humanity had almost forgotten. The bears appeared one last time as the gathering ended. Not just the mother and her cubs, but dozens of them, emerging from the forest to surround the circle of humans. It should have been terrifying, but instead it was profoundly moving. These were not wild animals, but partners, fellow consciousness in different forms, acknowledging the alliance that had been forged through sacrifice and gift. The mother bear, now old and moving slowly, approached Lily and Haley. She stood before them, and in her eyes Lily saw recognition, gratitude, and something that might have been love. Then, with a dignity that transcended species, the bear bowed, actually bowed, before turning and leading her clan back into the forest. That evening, as the saved children dispersed back to their lives and works around the world, Lily, Ethan, and Haley sat together in Lily's kitchen, the same kitchen where so much of this journey had been planned and processed. They were older now, marked by years of carrying this secret, of protecting this truth. But they were not tired. If anything, they were energized by what they'd witnessed, by the knowledge that the network was growing stronger, that humanity's chance of remembering its place in the web of life was increasing. The forest had given them a gift, but they had given the forest something too: their dedication, their protection, their willingness to bridge two worlds that had grown too far apart. Haley, now a young woman, but still carrying that ancient wisdom in her eyes, spoke of the future. More children would be saved, she said, but the real work was not in the dramatic healings, but in the quiet, constant effort to rebuild the connection between humanity and nature. Every tree planted with intention, every moment spent in conscious appreciation of the natural world, every choice to preserve rather than destroy, these were the threads that would reweave the web of consciousness that industrialization had torn. The forest had shown them that miracles were possible, but miracles were not the point. The point was the relationship, the recognition that humans were not separate from nature but part of it, cells in a larger organism that was Earth itself. As night fell and they prepared to part, each returning to their own aspect of the work, they stood together one last time at the window, looking toward the forest. It stood there as it had for centuries, patient, enduring, conscious. It had saved Haley, had saved Savannah, had saved dozens of others over the generations. But in saving them, it had really been saving itself, ensuring that there would always be humans who remembered, who could speak for the speechless, who could bridge the gap between two forms of consciousness that needed each other more than either fully understood. The work would continue, the secret would be protected and shared in equal measure, and the forest would endure, not just as trees and animals, but as a living testament to the deeper truth that all life was one life, experiencing itself in myriad forms. The story that had begun with a desperate mother and a dying child had become something larger. A movement without a name, a revolution without violence, a return to something humanity had known before it forgot. The bear's gift had been more than healing. It had been awakening. And that awakening spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, each circle larger than the last, until eventually, perhaps, the whole pond would be in motion. The forest had patience measured in centuries. It could wait for humanity to remember, and in the meantime, it would continue to save those it could, one child at a time, one miracle at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, until the boundary between human and nature dissolved entirely, and the earth could heal itself through the consciousness of all its parts working in harmony.